This is the 6th and hopefully final update for the gameplay overhaul mod everyone forgot about. For a good 6 months or so, this was strictly a visual project that only removed the knight's base skin, spells, and minions and replaced them with a crimson-caped, fire-themed appearance. It took me a good deal of time, but it was still just a reskin at its core. It was really nothing else. It's taken us a while to deliver on our promises, but enemy placements have been completely remixed for a more New Game Plus experience. Bosses are stronger and faster, and I'm actually very excited to see how some people play around with the new charm system. And just as an aside before we continue, I think the news has spread pretty quickly at this point, but I'm putting it in this video just to signal boost what I think most people have already heard. The Hollow Knight Wiki officially has a new home. The Wiki's editors have been maintaining fandom's wiki resource for all kinds of Hollow Knight information very well over the years, but the fandom site has been increasingly tightening their grip around the freedom of how editors maintain their wikis, and a lot of cases are now forced into using incredibly unhelpful features. This is quite a massive turning point, and because of the sheer amount of info and time some editors have dedicated to the fandom wiki, a perfectly seamless transition over to a new site is next to impossible, because the search engine metadata still favors the fandom wiki just because of the amount of time it's been up. The current wiki on fandom cannot be closed, but it will no longer be preserved by its main editors in the future. I've posted a link to the new wiki in the description in a pinned comment, just pretty much everywhere. I know my Hollow Knight videos don't get that much attention nowadays, partly because I don't make them anymore, but I wanted to do what I could just to signal boost the new site. A couple months after I uploaded a video to the channel sharing the skin, I was contacted by a couple of experienced modders saying that I should consider extending the scope of the project into a fully fleshed out mod, and that mod has now technically been in development for around 2.5 years now, but as most people have probably already observed, the absence of Silksong's presence, coupled with a distinct lack of positive updates about the game's current state, really started to impact our motivation for the project after a while. However, we've recently picked up tons of speed again due to the bringing on board of another team member to help us with the mod's official soundtrack. And just a full disclaimer here, this part of the mod will likely be added in a later update once the mod is fully released and people have had enough time to get a feel for its combat flow. It's unlikely that the soundtrack will be released in tandem with the mod itself, but multiple updates are planned for the future. Throughout this development log series, I've been showcasing charm changes, the application of burn damage as a sort of damage over time element that encourages the player to employ new gameplay strategies they normally wouldn't, and mostly just what comprises the knight's arsenal. The only aspect of the mod that hasn't really been touched on yet is the caliber of enemy you'll be actually fighting, and with the numerous speed changes we've made to the knight that results in a much faster and more fluid combat flow, a lot of the enemies, and specifically the bosses you face, need to be able to contend with you on equal ground. Boss attack speed and frequency have been upped across the board, various adjustments have been made to projectile speed to pose a threat to players even despite their quicker moveset, and most large encounters just involve much more aggression than before. I don't want to spoil everything we've been working on in a single video, obviously, but in order to properly explain what the end goal is for these adjustments, I'm going to walk you through a few of the most significant changes that not only give most boss encounters a fresh new feel, but in some cases entirely alters the strategy in which you have to approach them. Let's first focus on the Traitor Lord, particularly because I always found this boss to be incredibly underwhelming despite finding him towards the end of the game. At only 800 HP, the Traitor Lord's health pool can get burned down in seconds if you're even somewhat capable of knowing how to keep up with his rhythm. This is the key component behind what makes the Traitor Lord feel so insubstantial, yet suddenly very threatening when you slip up just once and end up getting punished with 2 damage. Even with 12 mask shards found, that's still only 3 hits you're allowed to take without dying in total. This sounds threatening on paper, but in practice, you can hard counter anything the Traitor Lord throws at you by simply jumping or dashing or parrying out of the way at the right time, and you'll still be left with a window plenty large enough to land at least 2 counter hits of your own. When phase 2 approaches and he begins battering the ground with his shockwave and throwing his scythe projectiles, they're only ever done individually and are almost never in danger of overlapping with his normal dash attacks due to an incredibly large window of time where he just idles about while the shockwaves or the scythes continue off screen. It's not that the fight has a specific tempo, it's just that it's too easy to keep up with the tempo most of the time. Okay, now this is a 30-second clip of the modded Traitor Lord fight. Most of his idle windows have been significantly decreased in order to match the knight's enhanced mobility. He's now only able to attack with a single shockwave before switching to another attack, but there's two notable changes here intended to make the Traitor Lord a much larger threat. Firstly, the boss is much quicker to recover from his idle window, pushing him back into the action nearly 3 times as fast as normal. Secondly, the velocity of the shockwave is much slower, keeping it relevant for a longer period of time. This makes the response of immediately dodging through it less reliable, as the wave is now more of an encroaching force that demands a bit more forethought to properly avoid. The two scythes now have a closer proximity to each other, but spread further apart the longer they travel, making it a potentially risky move to be too far away from the boss when you decide to dodge them. All these changes result in a boss that's extremely threatening up close, yet being up close is also the ideal position. Next, let's take a look at the Soul Master, which has remained one of my favorite bosses in the game through the years. The Soul Master actually has quite a wide moveset of attacks and various positions he can take up during the fight, but the idle windows are incredibly large due to the boss being placed near the early to mid game, giving you much more time to reorient and prepare for his next attack. This one actually took a bit of work, but it also ended up being one of the most fun to just mess around with. Adjusting his height when he prepares his downward slam is really fun, because it can make him teleport off screen entirely, resulting in a sort of airstrike slam that makes the attack feel a bit more weighty. You also can't tell if the fake out animation has taken place visually due to his insane altitude, leading to this really tense couple of seconds where you just have no way to properly gauge where he's planning to drop. Some various changes have been made to the physics of his soul orbs to make them a bit more in the way, and his second phase is much more aggressive and bullet spammy than usual, meaning taking advantage of his vulnerability will be that much harder a task. This is a recurring theme in most of the modded boss fights, only because they need to be quicker to fairly match the knight's increased agility. So if they seem a little too fast to keep up with right now, just remember that I'm not that good at the game and I'm still not taking any hits in this footage, so. The third of the 5 bosses I want to showcase here is the God Tamer, which is a fight that's attracted mostly negative criticism over time for being one-sided, easily exploitable, and just generally not that threatening. I'm guessing this was due to it being placed at the very end of the final Colosseum challenge, meaning the stakes are noticeably higher, but the two halves of the fight seem to behave their own way, completely independent from one another. The Tamer only has a single significant attack where she leaps toward you and slashes. The Lobster can close distance rapidly by rolling towards you and then ricocheting off the wall and landing somewhere close to your location. In the modded fight, the Lobster is highly defensive and doesn't travel much, and when it does, it's almost always rolling quickly from one side of the Colosseum to the other. Instead of its spitting attack spanning the width of the arena with a few gaps in between, it now spits in a large area directly in front of itself. Whereas the Lancer's significantly decreased idle times and wider jump range make her more of a constantly pursuing force that's always looking to close in and land a hit. So anyone who's ever played a Dark Souls game knows exactly what I'm trying to accomplish with this. Most of the excitement from duo fights comes from them both having juxtaposing tactics that threaten you in different ways. Ornstein and Smo from Dark Souls 1 and Theseus and Asterius from Hades are both wonderful examples. In the modded God Tamer fight, the Lancer is much more nimble and does everything she can to be a constant danger, whereas the Lobster's role is more focused around space denial and interference. The Lobster's defensive behavior and beefier health pool means you won't be able to take it out as easily. The fourth boss I'm spotlighting is the modded Sly boss in the God Home. Sly has a lot of adjustable variables in his fight, so I actually ended up having a lot of fun with this one. There only needed to be a slight decrease in his idle windows because Sly was already capable enough at matching the knight in speed. His attack strings felt random to an extent, but I didn't realize how structured everything actually was until I fought him a couple more times. The modded fight aims to mix up his moveset a bit and have him rely less on structured attack patterns. For instance, his nail arts are now performed at a more random interval than before in the first phase, but cut him down to half HP and the randomness is taken out almost completely, and every other attack could be a nail art in his second phase, and he can even perform 2 or 3 consecutively. Certain attacks like the Cyclone Slash have an extended duration, and its area of effect hovers slightly above the ground to encourage pogoing from above him, while his Dash Slash can suddenly change directions at the very last second, traveling towards you but then slashing behind himself. Ideally, this fight forces an economic use of the Shade Cloak while relying on the iframes of parries to assist you in situations you can't dodge out of. During his rage phase, his movements are obviously much quicker than before, perhaps even to an absurd extent, but his recovery time after attacking is actually extended by a small amount, making him more of an offensive threat in the final phase, but also giving him a more glaring weakness. Finally, I am giving the spotlight to the modded Zero boss, mostly because I just finished it a couple days ago and feel like getting some opinions on it. His first phase remains relatively unadjusted, aside from being a bit more proactive with his blades. During his second phase, however, Zero can now hover horizontally while aiming and shooting his blades, a degree of movement he normally doesn't have. Each of his 4 blades have slightly different casting speeds, velocities, and total distances, and by staggering the rate at which he throws them at you, it can be really difficult to get a read on his momentum. One of his swords can travel a much longer distance than before as well. Try to snipe him with a fireball from across the arena and you run the risk of getting sniped yourself. It won't happen all the time, but it'll happen just enough to make you second guess your safety. I'm approaching most Dream Warrior bosses with a similar design idea, because even though they rely heavily on bullet hell tactics, there's still always a distinct pattern to them that makes them easily cheesable if you fought them more than once. Hopefully the approach of staggering certain projectiles can give them a bit more offense potential in practice and make them a little harder to read. I don't want to reveal everything that's been in the pipeline, but if the footage I've been showing here is any indication, we've been putting everything we've got into the final push. I'm still not too confident in releasing like an official deadline or date or anything, but if everything goes smoothly over the course of the next couple months, then hopefully the very next update you hear from me will be the launch announcement. We're almost there, just hang in there.